As the Manhattan jury deliberates whether Donald Trump is guilty of election interference, Trump's attorneys are spinning conspiracy theories that are so ridiculous, even the Fox propaganda network is publicly calling them out, and we have to talk about it. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bell before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to look at in this video. It's a pretty historic situation, even though comparatively, we haven't been discussing the Manhattan trial all that much, but this is potentially the first criminal conviction of a former president. There are 34 counts, which means there are going to be 34 different verdicts. None of them have been presented yet, and it's up in the air. But the situation is this. While all of this is going on, Donald Trump's attorneys are spinning ridiculous conspiracy theories suggesting that President Biden is nefariously puppeteering this whole situation. And it's so bad that even the Fox propaganda network finds it ridiculous.
Because he's got to distract the American people. Listen,
but the Biden administration is not responsible for this trial.
How can you say the Biden administration is not responsible for this trial?
It's a state trial. It's Alvin Bragg. Whether you think there's a political motive for him, it's not connected to the DOJ. I mean,
Shannon,
the feds passed on these election charges.
Shannon, you should look at how many logs they have of state officials, Letitia James, Fannie Willis, visiting the White House, and then tell me that this is not a Biden trial. I don't care.
The feds pass on this case is the point I'm
You're
making.
Right. The feds pass on this case. Also, DA Cy Vance passed on this case. And
years
frankly,
ago, and then it came back.
And Bragg passed on this case. You know when it came back? When he decided to run for office. So tell me how that's not an indication that Joe Biden, who just sent his campaign down here with Robert De Niro yesterday, isn't a part of this. Frankly, any question that we had of that was squashed yesterday. And if you have even more concerns about whether he's involved in this, look at the fact that he is publicizing, literally publicizing for tonight to have a speech if a verdict comes out. That's a sad state of affairs. Meanwhile, our country is falling apart. He's got bigger fish to fry.
Do you not think, though, that any president would want to weigh in on something that's this historic?
Yes, they would. And I see no reason why we should hold President Biden to absurd standards that Republicans themselves can constantly and continuously betray. I mean, a couple of things here. Number one, the fact that Democratic elected officials like Attorney General Letitia James, and District Attorney Alvin Bragg had visited the White House before when the occupant of the White House is a Democratic president, that's not proof of a conspiracy theory. Republican elected officials visit the White House when Republicans are president and vice versa. You need much more than that. And the fact of the matter is that there's a reason that Alvin Bragg brought the charges eventually. As Lawfare, one of the preeminent blogs on the situation, as they point out, shortly before publication of a book on the subject, Bragg began presenting the hush money case to a grand jury. The indictment was handed up in late March 2023. Prosecutors said in a pretrial filing last November that they ultimately decided to bring the case in part based on new information, which included grand jury testimony in early 2023 from, quote, 2 Trump campaign insiders. The insiders' names are redacted from the filing, but one may have been Hope Hicks, a communications operative in the Trump administration. And yeah, it's here in the pre-filing motion made by Alvin Bragg that additional information had been procured after Cy Vance and Alvin Bragg had initially declined to take up the case. So with new information comes a different decision. Now, I will say the whole thing is just so absurd, like I said, that even the Fox propaganda network feels inclined to call it out and say, listen, this is ridiculous. There's no proof of this. Alina Habba says, well, listen, I mean, they're Democrats, and Biden showed up effectively, or the Biden campaign showed up outside the Manhattan courtroom during the case. Well, the very last day when closing arguments were presented, and by the way, Republicans had been politicizing this every day court was in session. You had Donald Trump routinely violating his own gag order, attacking the judge, attacking the judge's family, attacking court clerks, attacking officers of the court, attacking jurors, attacking witnesses, potentially engaging in jury intimidation. And you all were claiming every step of the way that the Biden campaign and that the Democrats were politicizing this, even though they were nowhere in sight. So yeah, the Biden campaign finally showed up and said, listen, if you're going to make these claims, then we might as well speak our truth. We might as well call out Donald Trump for the corrupt, incompetent criminal that he is. But now Alina Habba is saying, well, that's proof. Well, you all were making the claims prior to proof anyway, and it's really not any proof of anything nefarious. The fact of the matter is whether Donald Trump is a criminal is politically relevant to the 2024 election, which, by the way, you all were making that case because you were complaining that Trump should be able to talk more about the case and its particular actors, the officers of the court, their family members, et cetera, and so forth, because it's a political issue. So you see, Trump's attorneys are trying to have it both ways. It's political when it's convenient for them, and it's supposed to be apolitical when it's inconvenient for the Biden campaign. But that just goes to show that the Trump campaign can only function on double standards. They're unprincipled hypocrites to the core. Now, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what's going to happen. The legal consensus seems to be that a conviction of Trump is most likely. Now, again, there's not going to be one single guilty or not guilty. There's going to be 34 counts, 34 guilties, 34 not guilties, a combination thereof. But the legal consensus seems to be it's very likely that Trump will be convicted, at least in part. Second likely option is a hung jury, in which case, one or some of the 12 jurors decide not to go with the majority. And if there's a hung jury, then it goes probably to a mistrial, because you have to have unanimity in verdicts and sentencing decisions and things like that. Okay. A full acquittal in which Trump is found not guilty based on these 34 counts seems the least likely by far, according to the consensus of legal commentary that I've seen. It's so bad that Newsmax commentator Todd Starnes says Donald Trump needs to get out of New York City right now, fly back to Mar-a-Lago or another state that will provide him safe harbor, effectively where he needs to escape, right? This so-called principled conservative who's a part of the party of law and order is telling a criminal defendant that they need to flee the jurisdiction in which that trial is taking place and go to a place where you won't be extradited back because the case is looking so bad for you. That doesn't really sound like upholding law and order principles. Now, I gave Fox News kudos earlier. I'm going to have to deduct some points now because whereas they occasionally show signs of integrity, then they say stupid stuff like in the clip I'm about to show you, in which they complained about the fact that Donald Trump's defense attorney wasn't able to try to browbeat or guilt trip the jury during closing arguments with the fact that if Donald Trump is guilty, he'll go to prison. This is a standard practice all across this country where defense attorneys and prosecutors are not, during closing arguments, allowed to tell the jury or remind the jury or try to manipulate the jury by pointing out that if they find the person in question guilty, that person will go to jail. But the Fox Propaganda Network has conveniently forgotten that, and now they're complaining that Trump's defense attorney is somehow being censored.
Todd Blanche, the defense attorney, said, he said, look, the former president could go to jail. And the judge said that is outrageous. And why it matters? It's not the first time that Judge Merchan has reprimanded the defense for their conduct in the courtroom. So they just kept after. You weren't even allowed to say that this president faces going to jail.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So we're talking about what could happen to the former president. Easily. He could go to jail if found guilty.
As experts say, Brian, it's normal to talk about liberty issues in court. This is not uncommon for.
It is uncommon. It's in fact illegal as far as I'm aware. It's forbidden for you to mention that sort of thing in closing arguments in any courtroom. Okay. So I'm not sure what she's talking about whatsoever. One other thing that I want to point out here is that, again, the final verdict has to be unanimous, right? All 12 jurors have to say he's guilty or not guilty, and anything other than that would be considered, again, a hung jury. But there's a little caveat here, which is that when Judge Merchan issued instructions, he's like, listen, for the guilty verdict, did Donald Trump engage in some sort of conspiracy to steal the election by doing things with criminal intent? You have to have consensus there. But in terms of what the secondary crime in question is, you don't have to have consensus. There's room for debates. So this is what he says. Although you must conclude unanimously that the defendant conspired to promote or prevent the election of any person to public office by unlawful means, you need not be unanimous as to what those unlawful means were. In determining whether the defendant, Trump, conspired to promote or prevent the election of any person to a public office by unlawful means, you may consider the following: violations of the Federal Election Campaign Act, otherwise known as FECA, or the falsification of other business records, or violation of tax laws. So as Kyle Cheney, an attorney, points out, while we're waiting, this is Merchan's actual instruction. The jury must be unanimous about whether an underlying crime, a conspiracy to violate New York state election law, occurred, but not about the unlawful means Trump used to do it. And of course, the Fox Propaganda Network ran with that one too. They're like, see, Judge Merchan is violating the Constitution and violating the Supreme Court's rulings and holdings that, things must be unanimous by saying they need not be. It's just not true. In terms of whether or not Donald Trump committed a crime, there has to be unanimity there. But as to what the unlawful means were to commit that crime, there can be room for debate. So, yeah, again, the verdict is not in yet. And listen, I'm not an attorney. I don't have a crystal ball. I dare not presume. I defer to experts in this case. The vast majority of experts I've seen, including people, on Fox News and Republicans, J.D. Vance, a Republican senator from Ohio, an attorney, he thinks it would be, quote, a miracle if Trump is acquitted in this situation, which leads me to believe that the vast majority of people believe that Trump will either be convicted or he may get a reprieve in the form of a hung jury, but that a full-blown acquittal is highly unlikely. I don't know. I defer to experts. We'll see what happens. But yeah, right now it does seem like Trump's attorneys are in full-blown panic mode, and that doesn't signal anything, I think, but potential good news for the rest of America. When Trump is freaking out, when Trump's attorneys are freaking out, it tends to be good news for the rest of us. But the verdict is not in yet. So I would not be conducting victory laps if I were you. Let me know what you think in the comments.